Hey everybody, Aaron Rift here from NoDQ.com. Welcome to WCW Wednesday. Today I will be looking at the WCW pay-per-views from 2000 and the few that we had in 2001. WCW was really falling off a cliff heading into the first pay-per-view of 2000, which was sold out. Vince Russo had reformed the NWO and it was scheduled to be Bret Hart versus Sid Vicious for the WCW title and Jeff Jarrett versus Chris Benoit in a triple threat theater, WCW's version of Three Stages of Hell. But there were several things that occurred. First of all, Bret Hart got injured, and his injury was serious. It ended up being career-ending. His concussion from Starrcade. And then you had Jeff Jarrett, I believe, also getting a concussion. And both Jarrett and Bret Hart notified WCW a couple of days before the pay-per-view. So WCW had no time to put together a new card. Vince Russo suggested the idea of Tank Abbott winning the WCW title as a huge surprise. But the people in WCW did not approve of that. And they thought Vince Russo was nuts. So they sent him home. Vince Russo was sent home. WCW had to scramble. Kevin Sullivan got involved again. They had to rebook the entire show pretty much. You had a new triple threat theater where Kidman was against members of the Revolution. The first match on the show was Kidman versus Dean Malenko in a catch-as-catch-can match. Basically, the loser is the person that gets thrown to the outside of the ring. Apparently, Dean Malenko wasn't filled in. He just went to the outside of the ring. Referee called for the bell. And that was it. Total confusion. And looking at this pay-per-view, you have to keep in mind of all the backstage turmoil. You had frustrations from several wrestlers in WCW, including Dean Malenko, Perry Saturn, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Shane Douglas. And all of them ended up quitting after the pay-per-view because they were so frustrated with how things were going. You had a cruiserweight title match, Oklahoma versus Medusa. These two going at it for the Cruiserweight title. Cruiserweight title was completely dead by this point. This was just awful. The best match on the show was actually a last man standing match between Buff Bagwell and Diamond Dallas Page. I really enjoyed the storyline here. Considering it's Vince Russo, I felt that he did a good job with this whole love triangle storyline between DDP, his wife Kimberly, and Buff Bagwell. The promos were good. It was entertaining. And the match itself was very good. You felt like these two guys really did not like each other. So this was well done. And then you had Kevin Nash versus Terry Funk for the commissionership of WCW. If anything, this was an entertaining match because Terry Funk was just taking a tremendous beating. And even Terry Funk in his 50s is still more entertaining than most of what WCW had to offer at this point. And then you had the world title match, Chris Benoit versus Sid Vicious. This was okay, considering the fact that it was Sid in there. Chris Benoit did his best to make the match memorable, and it was okay. You had Chris Benoit putting on the crossface, and Sid had his foot under the bottom rope, so they were actually able to use this once Chris Benoit quit the company immediately after the show. They were able to use this to strip Benwall the title and have a new match to crown a brand new WCW champion. But overall, it was just a complete disaster for WCW this entire pay-per-view. The production values were as bad as ever. One thing about Vince Russo when he came in is the pacing of the shows got much faster, and I think that the WCW production team was just not able to get up to speed with it, so to speak. And the production values are just so many cuts and so many missed camera shots. It was pretty bad on a technical level as well as creatively what was being presented on the show. Moving on here to the first post-Russo pay-per-view, WCW Super Brawl 2000. This was an awful show. One of the worst WCW pay-per-views of all time. One of the worst wrestling pay-per-views of all time. Almost every match was poor. You had such classics as The Wall versus the Kiss Demon. That's right, the Kiss Demon on a WCW pay-per-view. I guess the backstory was that months back when Eric Bischoff put together a deal with Kiss. Part of the stipulation was that the Kiss Demon would get a pay-per-view match. So this was the pay-per-view match, and it sucked big time. And then you had a leather jacket on a pole match. You would think Vince Russo had some involvement in the show, but he actually had nothing to do with this pay-per-view. Tank Abbott versus Big Al. Where did they get Big Al from? This was just atrocious. And then to top it off, you had Tank Abbott pulling a knife on Big Al, and his exact words were, "I am going to fucking kill you." Actually, it was, I can fucking kill you. Something like that. But yeah, he used those words, "I will fucking kill you, I can fucking kill you." And then the production people immediately cut away from it. Yeah, one of the most notorious moments in WCW history right there. The rights for Harlem Heat. You had Ahmed Johnson, now known as Big T, against Booker T over the rights to use the name T, or the letter T. Yeah, they were feuding over the letter T. Not really much more to say about it. Ahmed Johnson in there, very much overweight, bigger than he was in WWE, couldn't do anything. Awful match. Then you had what should have been a great WCW moment. You had the Cat bringing out James Brown. And you had James Brown endorsing the Cat and the two of them dancing together. But the problem is WCW essentially made fans believe that there was no chance of James Brown showing up. WCW could have done promos. They could have done some kind of build-up so fans knew James Brown was going to be there. Maybe it would have helped the pay-per-view buy rate. You could have done that, but no. They had a fake James Brown come out on Nitro, and the Cat was a heel, so nobody thought that James Brown would bother showing up on a WCW show. But he actually did appear, and WCW didn't get anything out of this. It could have been a great moment for WCW, but, you know, a lot of people forgot about it, and what a waste. I mean, it was just such a waste of James Brown. You could have used him to get people talking about WCW, and they just had him come out randomly when nobody thought he was going to show up. Then you had a death match between Ric Flair and Terry Funk, a rematch from their 1989 classic. This match was not that good, but because it's Ric Flair and Terry Funk, it's passable. Then you had Hulk Hogan versus the Total Package. Once again, because it's Hulk Hogan, I guess you can say it's passable. But, I mean, just seeing this match in the year 2000, when you had Stone Cold and The Rock on Raw in the WWE, you know, this was just very embarrassing to watch. And then you had the world title three-way dance, Sid Vicious versus Jeff Jarrett versus Scott Hall. Decent triple threat match. Notable because it was the final appearance of Scott Hall in WCW. As a matter of fact, it was also the final appearance of Roddy Piper in WCW. He came out as a special referee when all the referees were taken out. So the last appearances of Roddy Piper and Scott Hall in WCW to cap off this terrible WCW pay-per-view. Moving on, we have Uncensored 2000, another terrible WCW pay-per-view, just as bad as Super Brawl. Really no good matches on this show from top to bottom. And this was the thing about WCW. At least during 97 and 98, you could rely on really solid undercards. Even if your main events were bad, you still had a good undercard for the most part in WCW. But here, you didn't even have that. There was no above average matches on this entire show. This should tell you all you need to know. When the best part of this show was during a Falls Count Anywhere match between Vampiro and Fit Finlay, they were brawling in the concession areas, and a security guard was trying to back fans away, and one of the fans just pushed the security guard and he fell right on his ass. This was the highlight of this pay-per-view. So that is all you need to know. You had Sid Vicious versus Jeff Jarrett for the world title. Terrible match. Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair in a Yappa Pie Indian strap match, Jack. The promo Hogan did before this match was more entertaining than this match. Let's just put it that way. Then we had the returns of not just Vince Russo, but Eric Bischoff as well to form the new WCW. It was going to be a whole new playing field, as Vince Russo put it. And we had Spring Stampede, the first Russo-Bischoff pay-per-view. All the titles were stripped, and we had a series of tournaments to crown new champions. I will say this was a very fast-paced pay-per-view, and that's what Vince Russo was known for. One of the things he was known for, the shows were much faster-paced. You didn't get the quality of wrestling, but the thing about Super Brawl and Uncensored before is those pay-per-views were just very slow-paced and boring. At least this show, things were moving along and things were happening. Too many things happening, but at least this show was more entertaining than Super Brawl and Uncensored. You had the World Tag Team title finals, Bagwell and Shane Douglas winning the tag titles, Sunny, Tammy Sitch making her appearance in WCW for a cup of coffee. You had Scott Steiner versus Sting for the U.S. title. You had Vampiro coming from under the ring. Once again, WCW trying to emulate WWE with the sports entertainment storylines, guys coming from out of the ring and all that, and the blood falling down from the ceiling. Stuff that had already been done in WWE, but Russo was trying to do it in WCW as well. You had one segment where Hogan was backstage trying to get his hands on Bischoff, and you had all these police officers coming in, and they were all pulling their guns on Hulk Hogan, and Mark Madden in his Daffy Duck voice said, "Shoot him now!" I just wanted to note that Mark Madden's commentary was horrible during WCW at this time. Scott Hudson wasn't that good as well, and they kept making all these insider references that only 5% of the audience are going to understand, and you wonder why so many casual fans tuned out. I mean, they were probably confused as hell trying to make sense of what was going on with all these insider terms. And then you had the final match. Jeff Jarrett beat DDP when Kimberly turned her back on her husband. The classic Vince Russo swerve. And once Kimberly was in there with the guitar, it was so obvious where this was going. But of course, it is a swerve. She hit her own husband with the guitar, and Jeff Jarrett wins the title. Next up, we have Slamboree 2000, which, in my opinion, was probably the best WCW pay-per-view of 2000. This was the one that I would recommend the most. It was an entertaining show, and you had a few good matches on the show as well. So you had some quality wrestling, and the storylines were very much over the top, but it was an entertaining show from top to bottom, in my opinion. You had Hugh Morris coming out. He was sick of being embarrassed by WCW, and he hated the fact that Eric Bischoff gave him the name Hugh Morris. So he was going to change his name to his real name, Hugh G. Rection. This was just hilarious for all the wrong reasons. You had Sean Stasiak making his first WCW pay-per-view appearance. Maybe he appeared at Spring Stampede, I don't remember, but he was basically doing a knockoff of Mr. Perfect's gimmick, complete with the music. You had Chuck Palumbo coming out and being a copycat of Lex Luger. And then you had some quality matches on the show. You had Chris Kanyon versus Mike Awesome. Kanyon was really good. Even during the worst period of WCW, Kanyon always went out there and gave it his best effort and put on good matches. So, hats off to Chris Kanyon. And this was when Mike Awesome still had some credibility in WCW, coming in as the ECW champion and being the career killer. Hogan versus Kidman. For a Hulk Hogan match, this was above average, and you can give Billy Kidman credit for that. And you give Hogan credit as well because he did try his hardest to hang with Billy Kidman and try to keep up and have a decent match. So, this was a good match, even though it was your typical heel referee match where Eric Bischoff was the referee and, not counting the fall when Hogan had the match won, all that usual stuff. I mean, the special referee gimmick had been really overplayed by this point with the heel referees, but this was still an entertaining match. Ric Flair versus Shane Douglas, a feud that if you're a hardcore wrestling fan and you were following ECW, this was a match you were really looking forward to. I think everybody else was confused as hell, but this was a fun match, and Shane Douglas going for the 10 punches in the corner on Flair, and he yells out, "Fuck you, Flair," before he starts hitting him. This was fun. This was a fun match. Then you had the hardcore title, Terry Funk and Norman Smiley, or Terry Funk against Norman Smiley and Ralphus. This was entertaining. Like I said, Terry Funk was always entertaining in WCW, even when he was in his 50s. And you had Ralphus out there. It was just so goofy and so over the top, but I found this match to be entertaining. And then you had the main event, Jeff Jarrett versus DDP versus the world champion David Arquette in a triple threat, triple cage match. I really liked the triple cage concept. I thought that that was unique, and I think it's unfortunate that WCW wasn't taken seriously at this point, because that match stipulation could have gone places in WCW, and you could have had some all-time classics. When it was just Jeff Jarrett and DDP, this was actually a pretty good match. These guys were having a very good cage match, and the whole storyline with David Arquette was ridiculous, him as champion. And then you had another swerve. You had David Arquette acting like he was going to hit Jeff Jarrett with a guitar, but no, he hit DDP with the guitar. So for the second straight month in a row, DDP gets screwed over. Somebody turns their back on him, and you have a big swerve. And then you had Kanyon coming out trying to save the day. Mike Awesome came out, and then Mike Awesome threw Chris Kanyon off the cage onto the walkway. Pretty crazy spot here. A lot of people were actually offended by it, though, because this pay-per-view was in Kansas City, in the same arena where Owen Hart had his accident. So a lot of people thought that this was in bad taste. Almost 1 year to the date from when Owen Hart's accident happened, they did this big spot, and people just thought it was in bad taste to do it. But it was pretty spectacular, and once again, Kanyon going all out to try to make the show entertaining. All right, next up we have the Great American Bash from 2000. This was a terrible show. Undercard sucked. You had a Human Torch match between Vampiro and Sting. The objective here was to set your opponent on fire. And the two of them ended up brawling on top of the Turnotron or the Nitro Vision, or whatever the hell they were calling their Titantron knockoff. The two of them were up on top of the screen, and the lights went out. When the lights came back on, you had a stunt double Sting. Vampiro lit the fake Sting on fire. Sting dived off the top of the Turnotron and landed on the crash pad below. This was awful. The announcers were selling it like Sting was killed and this terrible thing had occurred, but the show must go on. You had Mike Awesome versus Diamond Dallas Page in an ambulance match. You had Chris Kanyon at ringside in a wheelchair, still injured apparently from Slamboree, but just when we think he is hurt, it's actually another swerve. You have Kanyon turning on DDP. Once again, somebody screws over DDP. The storyline apparently was that Eric Bischoff was the only guy that visited Kanyon in the hospital, some crap like that. So yeah, if you're keeping count, you're keeping score, 3 pay-per-views in a row where somebody turns on DDP. Maybe DDP was the problem. Who knows? Then you had the main event, Jeff Jarrett versus Kevin Nash. Leading up to this show, WCW was hyping up this big surprise, a blockbuster surprise that not even Vince McMahon could stop. So this was what they were building up. This is how they put it, that Vince couldn't even stop this from happening. The big surprise ended up being a Goldberg heel turn. That's right, nothing Vince McMahon could do about that. Turning Goldberg heel was another bad decision from WCW, and your typical swerve where Goldberg comes out, looks like he's going to attack Jeff Jarrett, but no, he attacks Kevin Nash instead. The crowd was throwing crap in the ring, but I think that they were really pissed off, and the Goldberg heel turn was another flop from WCW. Moving on, we have the Bash at the Beach 2000, the infamous Bash at the Beach. You had Daphne versus Miss Hancock in a wedding gown match. I only make note of this match because it was such a train wreck that I found it to be highly entertaining. You had Kanyon, who is now positively Kanyon versus Booker T. I will say, at least we got something good out of all these swerves and Kanyon turning heel, because I did enjoy the positively Kanyon gimmick when he would randomly attack people with the Kanyon cutter. I thought that this was entertaining stuff, and this was a good match. You had Mike Awesome versus Scott Steiner for the U.S. title. This was a very good match as well. The two of them just beating the crap out of each other. Good brawl. I enjoyed it. And then you had Hulk Hogan versus Jeff Jarrett. A repeat of Halloween Havoc 99, except this time it was Jarrett who was laying down for Hogan. And then Hogan said, "This is why this company's in the shape it's in, because of bullshit like this." And then later on in the show, you had Vince Russo coming out, basically firing Hulk Hogan and saying that the world title was the Hulk Hogan Memorial title, and you'll never see Hulk Hogan in WCW again. And Vince Russo said the reason he was there was for the young guys, and it was time for the young guys to shine, so he was going to make a new match, Booker T versus Jeff Jarrett, for the WCW World title. So Russo coming out, doing his big work-to-shoot promo, and yeah, it was something else to watch. I will say that. I'm sure 95% of the people watching had no idea what was going on, but I did find this promo to be an all-time classic. Since day one he was in WCW, he had done nothing but deal with the bullshit politics behind that curtain. So it was a memorable promo from Vince Russo, even if it really just continued to put WCW in a deeper and deeper hole. Next up, we have Goldberg versus Kevin Nash with Scott Hall's contract on the line. I guess that this was their way to try and make people care about this match, because everyone loves Scott Hall, and Scott Hall was nowhere to be found, so they put the contract of Scott Hall on the line. Of course, Goldberg wins. Scott Hall has gone from WCW. Then you had the world title match, Booker T versus Jeff Jarrett, the real world title match. Another good match, and Booker T goes over, beats Jeff Jarrett, becomes a new champion, and it looks like we have a new WCW yet again. Which leads us to, in my opinion, one of the worst, if not the worst, WCW pay-per-view of all time, New Blood Rising. This pay-per-view from top to bottom was just a complete train wreck. I would not recommend this pay-per-view unless you really want to torture yourself. There was one good match on the show, and that was the opening match. It was a ladder match between 3 Count and the Young Dragons. But the problem is that they were fighting over a record contract and a gold record. So it was just so ridiculous, and it was hard to take any of these guys seriously. It's not like the WWF matches where you had the Dudleys and the Hardys and Edge and Christian fighting over the tag team titles. You had these guys fighting over a record contract, a fake record contract. So yeah, the stipulation was crap, but the match itself was good, and these guys were going all out. So it was an entertaining match at least. Then you had a Judy Bagwell on a pole match, but since she could not fit on a pole, they made it a Judy Bagwell on a forklift match. The less said about this, the better. Just avoid this at all costs. You had a camouflage mud match between Major Guns and Miss Hancock, where Miss Hancock was apparently pregnant, and the match ended when she started having these pains, like she was having issues with her unborn child or whatever. This was terrible. Then you had a WCW Tag Team Title 4 Corners match. Just a complete train wreck of a match. Awful stuff here. Sting versus the Demon, another lousy match. Why is the Demon on pay-per-view? And then we had a match that should have been a classic. Lance Storm versus Mike Awesome. This was in Canada, in Lance Storm's home country, and over the past several weeks prior to this show, WCW was doing a tremendous job with Lance Storm. They were building him up so well. I was really impressed. He won title after title after title. He lost to Booker T in a world title match, but that match itself was one of the best matches WCW ever produced. And Lance Storm was on his way to being a major superstar. I mean, WCW was really doing everything right with him until this show, when they completely botched Lance Storm and ruined him. He was in Canada. It was obvious going in he was going to be a major babyface to this audience. So what do? You make him this cowardly heel that has to have a fake referee out there in Jacques Rougeau. Mike Awesome ends up pinning Lance Storm for a 3 count, so they change the rules. It's now a first person to pin your opponent for a 5 count. Once again, Mike Awesome beats Lance Storm. They change the rules again. Now it's a submission-only match. Mike Awesome puts Lance Storm in a submission. The fans are cheering for Lance Storm. They want to see him make a comeback, but then he taps out. So the rules are changed yet again, and finally, Lance Storm wins the match. On paper, if it wasn't Lance Storm, if he wasn't built up so strongly leading up to this match, if it wasn't in Canada, I would have been okay with this. But it just completely buried Lance Storm and made him a complete joke when he had been booked so strongly leading up to this match. It was one of the most frustrating things I've ever watched in WCW, how they just took this guy who had so much momentum and ruined him in one night. And then you had Bret Hart come out at the end, but it really meant nothing at this point. I mean, it literally had no value, Bret Hart being there to endorse Lance Storm. It did nothing. Then you had one of the most infamous matches in WCW history, a triple threat between Goldberg and Scott Steiner and Kevin Nash. And basically the storyline here was that Kevin Nash was supposed to go over. He was supposed to win the match, and Goldberg broke the script. He decided he was not going to lose the match. He walked out. He left. Vince Russo came out, told him to get back in the ring, but Goldberg flipped him off or whatever and left. So then, as Tony Schiavone put it, Kevin Nash and Scott Steiner had to improvise and finish the match. What's going on here? Basically, WCW is admitting to the audience that wrestling is fake. That's what they did here. And it's the one rule you don't break. You don't tell people that what you're watching is fake. You know, people want to be able to suspend disbelief. So they really went way too far here. Russo went too far in trying to make this real or make people think it's real. It just was beyond ridiculous at this point. And then you had Booker T versus Jeff Jarrett for the world title. This was actually a good match too. So there were 2 good matches on this show, but there were so many bad things on this pay-per-view. And, you know, people ask me what was the worst WCW pay-per-view. In terms of a pay-per-view that I feel did more damage to the WCW product, a single pay-per-view that did more damage, it would be New Blood Rising. I think that after this pay-per-view, there was really no turning back for WCW, no way for them to recover and rebuild the brand again. So now we have your remaining post-New Blood Rising WCW pay-per-views, where it was hard to really be emotionally invested in anything that WCW was doing at this point. You had Fall Brawl. For some reason, they decided to change the logos for the WCW pay-per-views, and they had a really lame-looking logo for this show and for the remaining pay-per-views as well. You had Lance Storm versus General Rection. Another brilliant Vince Russo idea was to turn the beloved Jim Duggan, USA, good old USA Jim Duggan, turn him heel and have him join Team Canada. This sucked. Some guys you just don't turn, and Jim Duggan was one of those guys. I'm sure if Vince Russo had the opportunity, he would have turned Ricky Steamboat heel. You had a scaffold tag team match between Shane Douglas and Torrie Wilson against Billy Kidman and Medusa. Why are we doing a scaffold match again? I was glad to see those matches gone, but of course, Vince Russo has to bring this match back. And Medusa takes a big bump. Kidman takes a big bump off the top of the scaffold into the crash pad. And yeah, just another match that was ridiculous. Mike Awesome versus Jeff Jarrett in a bunkhouse brawl. This was actually a good match, but they had already ruined Mike Awesome by this point. They decided to make him the Fat Chick Thriller, where he was obsessed with fat chicks, and then they made him that 70s guy, where he came out in the disco outfit and the 70s music. They completely ruined Mike Awesome. So it was hard for me to really get into this match, but you know, both guys worked a really good match here, and it was pretty good from a technical standpoint at least. Then you had Scott Steiner versus Goldberg, no disqualification. Goldberg had already gone back to being a babyface by this point, and I really enjoyed this match. This was one of the last really good WCW pay-per-view matches. Two guys just beating the hell out of each other. This was fun to watch. I enjoyed this, and Scott Steiner came off looking really strong in this match, and they were starting to build him up as the top heel in WCW. So this, I'll give a thumbs up. This was really the only match, the only segment on this entire pay-per-view that I really enjoyed. And finally, you had Booker T versus Kevin Nash, world title steel cage match. Kevin Nash had already beaten Booker T for the title, and then Booker T won it back here. Just a very standard cage match. Could be a random Nitro main event match. Really nothing to it. And then you had WCW Halloween Havoc 2000. A lot of interesting things went down between Fall Brawl and Halloween Havoc. Most notably, Vince Russo won the WCW title from Booker T. By this point, when I was watching WCW at the time, I was beyond caring. I'm like, okay, Vince Russo won the title. Who cares? Whatever. The titles meant nothing. Doesn't bother me at this point. Booker T would win back the title and would defend on this show against Scott Steiner. Scott Steiner would just go crazy and get himself disqualified. I thought that this was lame. I am not a fan of DQ finishes in major main event matches on pay-per-view, or any matches for that matter on pay-per-view. Stuff you're paying to see. You want to see decisive winners. Wasn't a fan of this. Jeff Jarrett versus Sting. If anything, I was entertained by this match because they had different Stings coming out. You had the 1990 Bleach Blonde Sting. You had the 1995 Sting. You had the Wolfpack Sting coming out and trying to cost the real Sting the match. It was very much overbooked and over the top, but I was entertained by it at least. You had a lot of bad matches on this pay-per-view. Buff Bagwell versus David Flair in a DNA First Blood match. This was stupid. Mike Sanders versus the Cat. 3-round kickboxing match. Anytime you have a kickboxing match or a wrestler versus boxer match, I would avoid watching it. They never turn out to be any good, and this was no exception. And then your main event, your final match, was basically a squash match. Goldberg versus Chronic, 2-on-1 handicapped, and Goldberg made short work of them. And WCW was doing this new storyline now where Vince Russo announced that if Goldberg lost one more match, he would be fired from WCW. So Goldberg basically had to start up a new streak or be fired. And this was lame. Next up, we have WCW Mayhem 2000. Another terrible WCW pay-per-view, completely forgettable. You had one good match on this show, 3 count versus Evan Courageous and Jamie Noble versus the Young Dragons. When you had these guys in matches, they were always entertaining, and the 3 count Young Dragons feud was one of the highlights of WCW towards the end. So, I would always recommend checking out these matches. The main event, Scott Steiner versus Booker T. Scott Steiner finally winning the WCW title over Booker T. This was fine. WCW was doing a good job building up Scott Steiner as this unstoppable monster. He took out Sting prior to this show, and this would be the last time we'd see Booker T for several months. Next up, we have Starrcade, what would turn out to be the final Starrcade in WCW. This show was, I guess you could call it average. You had a really good match once again between 3 count versus Evan Courageous and Jamie Noble versus the Young Dragons, a 3-way tag team ladder match. Winner gets a cruiserweight title shot. At least that's a step up from getting a record contract. This was a very good match. Terry Funk versus Crowbar, as I mentioned earlier. Terry Funk always had entertaining matches in WCW, so I found this one to be perfectly acceptable. DDP and Kevin Nash versus The Perfect Event. This was a good match. Main event, Scott Steiner versus Sid Vicious for the world title. This was fine. Scott Steiner continuing his run as champion. No real problems with this. Decent main event, nothing spectacular, but it was okay for what it was. Then we head into 2001, which would end up being WCW's final year in operations. The first pay-per-view was called Sin, so they had dropped the sold-out name. Right before this pay-per-view, it was announced that Eric Bischoff and his group of investors would be buying WCW. So one thing I noticed about this show was it felt like there was a renewed sense of optimism in WCW. I felt that with the wrestlers in the ring and with the announcers. It felt like people had some kind of hope that WCW could finally turn things around. And this was a pretty good pay-per-view. I think that this was a slight thumbs-up show. You had Chavo Guerrero versus Shane Helms for the Cruiserweight title. They were finally starting to get back on track with the Cruiserweight division. This was a good match. You had Big Vito versus Reno, another good match. Young Dragons versus Evan Courageous and Jamie Noble. Very good match from these guys. Usual entertaining match. The Cat versus Mike Sanders for WCW Commissionership. The Cat wins it back. This was fine. You had a penalty box match with Jim Duggan as the referee. Jim Duggan already back to being a babyface now. Team Canada versus the Filthy Animals. This was entertaining. Ming versus Crowbar versus Terry Funk for the Hardcore title. Another fine match. Interestingly enough, though, Ming would win the Hardcore title and then jump ship to the WWE 2 weeks later at the Royal Rumble. That was interesting. You had Chuck Palumbo and Sean O'Hare against the Insiders, Kevin Nash and DDP. This was another good match. So yeah, a very solid card from WCW. Probably the best card from top to bottom that they had since Russo came into WCW back in October of '99. Then you had Totally Buff versus Goldberg and Dwayne Bruce, who was from the Power Plant, the guy that trained Goldberg. As it turns out, this would end up being Goldberg's last match in WCW. There was a fan at ringside who turned out to be affiliated with Buff Bagwell and Lex Luger. He maced Goldberg, and Goldberg ended up getting pinned by Luger and Bagwell, and Goldberg's career in WCW was over. Then we had the main event, which reminded me of an old WCW pay-per-view because you had a solid undercard and then you had an atrocious main event. Scott Steiner versus Jeff Jarrett versus Sid Vicious. This match is infamous for the Sid Vicious injury where he jumped off the second rope and broke his leg. It was really nasty to watch. But actually, you didn't see it on this pay-per-view because they had cut away backstage when it happened because they were showing the arrival of the Mystery Man because this was actually supposed to be a fatal four-way match, and the Mystery Man showed up late. But when he got to the ring, Sid had already been injured. Sid was on the ground. The Mystery Man literally hit Sid with a double axe handle, and then Scott Steiner pinned Sid Vicious and won the match. Guy unmasked to be Road Warrior Animal. What a disappointment. Road Warrior Animal, the mystery guy. And the finish was really lame here. Part of it due to Sid's injury and part of it just due to the lameness of Road Warrior Animal being the mystery guy. And yet another swerve in WCW. Ric Flair going heel as a result of this. Yeah, this main event sucked. Then we had Super Brawl Revenge. Not Super Brawl, but Super Brawl Revenge. Like Revenge would increase the pay-per-view buy rate. I don't know the reasoning behind the name change, but whatever. This was an okay pay-per-view. Another decent pay-per-view from WCW. Maybe a slight thumbs up. You had several good matches on this show. Once again, the Young Dragons and 3 Count. You had a 6-man elimination match. This was a good match, although it was a bit sloppy. You had Jimmy Wang Yang botching a bunch of things and slipping on the ropes. But, this was still an entertaining match for the most part. You had a Cruiserweight title match, Chavo Guerrero Jr. versus Rey Mysterio Jr. Another good match. Canyon versus DDP. It was originally supposed to be DDP versus Jeff Jarrett, but DDP had to face Canyon. Jarrett sent out Canyon to fight DDP. And you had a lot of outside interference. Canyon won the match. DDP was bloodied up. Then you had Jeff Jarrett come out and face DDP in a second match for DDP. And, this was actually really well done. I enjoyed both of these matches. DDP did get the win on Jeff Jarrett at the end, and this would lead to him challenging Scott Steiner at the next pay-per-view. So this was well done. Main event match, Scott Steiner versus Kevin Nash. Almost, from a storyline perspective, a repeat of the Lance Storm Mike Awesome match from New Blood Rising. At least Ric Flair was entertaining here. I will say that. He kept changing the rules. Kevin Nash came out in a wheelchair or whatever, and he acted like he was hurt. But then when Steiner's back was turned, he attacked Scott Steiner with the title belt and pinned him. So all this build up for Scott Steiner, and he gets pinned with one belt shot. This was lame, but Ric Flair was entertaining. He was going nuts and said that this was a 2 out of 3 falls match. I was entertained by it to a degree, but it was just so ridiculous. It took all these guys to beat Kevin Nash. I guess Kevin Nash was Superman at this point. And the stipulation here was the loser would leave WCW. So Kevin Nash would be gone. Scott Steiner did end up winning the match. And the storyline idea was that all these names, Goldberg, Kevin Nash, Sting, all these guys that Scott Steiner took out would come back and be part of the new Eric Bischoff-led WCW. But something happened here. Time Warner decided to pull the plug on WCW programming, and with that, Eric Bischoff's group of investors decided to back out. They did not want to buy WCW without WCW having a TV deal. So this was essentially the final death blow to WCW. Booker T was brought back early because the future of the company was uncertain. And then you had the final WCW pay-per-view, WCW Greed. Ironic title considering all the backstage politics in WCW and all the guys trying to get the big money contracts. You had the final pay-per-view called Greed. Interestingly enough, the announcers really didn't mention anything about WCW possibly going out of business or this being the last show. And the wrestlers, for the most part, still went out there and gave it their best performances. You had Jason Jett, who was Easy Money in ECW, versus Kiwi to open up the show. And Jason Jett looked really good here. And it's just unfortunate for him because he could have possibly made a name for himself in this WCW when things were finally starting to get back on track. But then WCW shut down, and his career never really went anywhere after that. You had a WCW Cruiserweight Tag Title match. Short-lived Cruiserweight Tag Team titles. I mean, WCW, once again, getting back on track, and then the company goes out of business. So you had the short-lived Cruiserweight Tag Team titles. This was a really good match. A lot of fun to watch. Elix Skipper and Kid Romeo versus Billy Kidman and Rey Mysterio Jr. Definitely would recommend this one. Shane Helms versus Chavo Guerrero for the Cruiserweight title. This was another good match. Very solid card here. WCW getting back to focusing on the Cruiserweights, but, as they say, too little, too late. World Tag Team title match. Chuck Palumbo and Sean O'Haire beating totally buff Bagwell and Lex Luger in about 30 seconds. This was just a complete squash match. I guess the backstory was that Bagwell and Luger did not want to job out to Palumbo and O'Haire, but WCW insisted on it. So rather than going out there and actually having a 10-minute match, apparently Bagwell and Luger decided just to go out there and do a quick squash and not have to work a long match if they're having to put over these guys. So that was their mentality, and I guess that they got a lot of heat for it. This was kind of an interesting match or segment, whatever you want to call it. I'd call it more of a segment because Bagwell and Luger came out there and were talking longer than there was an actual match. Then you had Dustin Rhodes and Dusty Rhodes versus Jeff Jarrett and Ric Flair. This was fun. I enjoyed this. Very nostalgic. The crowd was really into this one. This show was in Florida, so it was Dusty Rhodes country. Crowd was really into Dusty Rhodes, and he gave Jeff Jarrett the stink face at the end. This was entertaining. And then you had the main event match, Scott Steiner versus DDP, the final WCW pay-per-view match. And I thought it was a very good one. Very bloody match. Both guys were bleeding, brawling all over the place. You had your usual outside interference, but this was still a very good match and a good way to close out the WCW pay-per-views. Overall, Greed was a good pay-per-view, but it was sad to see WCW starting to rebuild the brand, and it was just too little, too late. And maybe if Bischoff's group was able to buy WCW, maybe they could have turned things around. Who knows? I mean, this was a fine show, but it was sad to see WCW be finished at this point. So there you have it for my WCW pay-per-view reviews. Took me about 8 months to get through all these shows. Hope you enjoyed the videos. Hope you got some kind of insight, and maybe you can have a good idea of what to watch and what not to watch. Lots of interesting moments in WCW. I would recommend checking out some of the pay-per-views on the WWE Network for just $9.99. Thank you guys so much for watching. Tell a friend about the videos, and stay tuned to NoDQ.com for the very latest in WWE and TNA.